The vast, open plains of Western Australia stretched endlessly, golden fields shimmering under the relentless sun. For the war veterans turned farmers, this land held the promise of a fresh start after the horrors of World War I. They had fought for their country with rifles and bayonets, enduring the deafening roar of artillery and the suffocating trenches of Europe. Now, their battlefield had changed. Armed with plows and determination, they sought to tame the unforgiving outback, to carve out a life from the dusty soil. But just as they began to rebuild, a new enemy emerged, one that neither bullets nor bayonets had prepared them for. From the horizon, they came tens of thousands of emus, their long necks bobbing in unison as they surged forward like a vast, feathered tide. The birds moved with eerie coordination, their dark eyes scanning the land ahead as they advanced with an almost military precision. At first, the farmers watched in disbelief, unsure whether to laugh or worry. But soon, horror set in as the massive flock descended upon their fragile wheat fields. The crops, painstakingly sown and nurtured through months of sweat and toil, were ravaged in mere hours. The emus tore through the fields, their powerful beaks ripping up stalks with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind a barren wasteland where golden wheat once stood. Panic spread as fast as the devastation. The farmers, many of whom had survived the worst battles of the Great War, found themselves powerless against this new invasion. Their rifles, which had once been their lifeline on the battlefield, were useless against the sheer numbers of the emus. Bullets were expensive, and for every bird struck down, dozens more took its place. The invaders were resilient, their thick feathers deflecting shots, their speed making them near impossible targets. As days passed, desperation grew. If the crops continued to fall, there would be no harvest, no food, no income, no survival. This was not just an agricultural disaster, it was a battle for existence. Word of the crisis spread beyond the isolated farms, reaching the ears of the government. The nation could not afford to lose its wheat supply, especially in the wake of the economic hardships that followed the war. The government had to act swiftly, and the answer seemed obvious. If soldiers could defeat enemy battalions on the battlefield, surely they could handle a flock of oversized birds. And so, in an unprecedented move, officials devised a plan that seemed both logical and effective: send in the army. With machine guns and military strategy, they would fight the emus as they had fought human adversaries before. The Great Emu War was about to begin. With military precision, the soldiers arrived, their boots kicking up clouds of dust as they stepped onto the battlefield. Armed with the powerful Lewis machine guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition, they carried the confidence of men who had once fought and triumphed against human enemies. Their orders were clear: eliminate the emus in large numbers, crush their ranks, and restore order to the besieged farmlands. This was not just an extermination effort, it was a battle, one that demanded strategy and firepower. The farmers watched from a distance, hopeful that the government's intervention would finally bring an end to their suffering. The battle lines were drawn, and the first engagement was set. As the first shots rang out, the emus reacted not with fear, but with an almost supernatural agility. The gunfire cracked through the air, sending bullets tearing across the dry landscape, but instead of dropping, the emus dodged and weaved through the barrage with uncanny precision. Their bodies twisted and turned, their long legs propelling them forward with bursts of incredible speed. Instead of panicking, the massive flock seemed to divide and regroup as if following an unseen strategy. The soldiers, expecting easy targets, found themselves facing an enemy that was not only relentless but also infuriatingly elusive. Frustration mounted as the troops adjusted their aim, firing again and again, but their targets scattered in all directions. The birds did not move as a single, compact horde but in smaller, unpredictable groups, making it nearly impossible to mow them down efficiently. The soldiers resorted to chasing them in vehicles, confident that speed would give them the advantage. But the emus, with their long, powerful strides, proved faster than the roaring engines. The uneven terrain made driving difficult, and time after time, the troops found themselves outpaced and outmaneuvered. The more they tried to control the battlefield, the more chaotic it became. The once confident operation descended into a humiliating struggle. Machine guns jammed from overuse, ammunition dwindled, and yet the emus remained largely unscathed, their numbers seemingly undiminished. What was meant to be a swift and decisive victory turned into an absurd war of endurance. The battlefield was littered not with fallen birds, but with empty shells and mounting frustration. What had begun as a show of military might had become a comedy of errors, a battle where the enemy neither surrendered nor fought back but simply outran and outlasted their human adversaries. The Great Emu War was proving to be a disaster. The war dragged on, but instead of being weakened, the emus became more cunning. No longer moving as one massive flock, they split into smaller, more agile groups. This adaptation made it nearly impossible for the soldiers to land effective shots. Whenever gunfire erupted, the emus reacted instantly. Some scattered in every direction, while others held their ground just long enough to serve as decoys. The moment the soldiers focused their fire on one group, the rest would vanish into the distance, untouched. Their movements were calculated, their reactions unnervingly precise, as though they had studied their enemy and learned how to counter their every move. The military's frustration gave way to disbelief. How could simple birds outwit trained soldiers? It was an unthinkable humiliation. The once confident troops now hesitated before engaging, knowing their chances of hitting anything were slim. Reports sent back to officials did not celebrate victories but instead detailed an ongoing disaster. Bullets were wasted at an alarming rate, vehicles broke down from endless, futile pursuits, and morale sank lower with each failed ambush. No matter how hard they tried, the soldiers remained 2 steps behind the emus. Meanwhile, the destruction of the wheat fields continued unchecked. For every failed engagement, for every bullet that missed its mark, the emus continued their feast. The farmland that was meant to sustain families and communities lay in ruins, trampled under the feet of an enemy that refused to be subdued. The farmers, who had once placed their hope in the military, now looked on with growing despair. What had begun as a bold operation to reclaim their land had turned into an absurd struggle against an adversary that simply refused to fall. By now, the war was no longer just about the crops, it was about pride. The government had sent trained men with machine guns to deal with birds, yet the birds were winning. With every failed mission, the realization became clearer: this was a war they could not win. Realization struck the government with full force. What had initially seemed like a simple task ridding the Australian countryside of emus had devolved into a catastrophic failure. The military had poured thousands of rounds of ammunition into the landscape, expending countless hours of manpower and resources, yet the emus remained as defiant as ever. They had adapted, using the terrain to their advantage, and the soldiers' efforts had done little to curtail their numbers. The entire campaign, meant to restore order, had only brought about humiliation and regret. The emus, resilient and untouchable, had triumphed over the might of the military. By December 1932, after months of relentless effort, the decision was made to withdraw. The official statement proclaimed the end of the operation, but the underlying reality was far less victorious for the government. The emus, unchecked, continued to roam the farmland, their presence a reminder of the operation's failure. In the aftermath, the government, unwilling to acknowledge their defeat fully, retreated to quieter measures. They turned their attention to less confrontational approaches, such as building fences and using other protective methods in an attempt to curb the emu population. But despite their new strategies, the damage to the government's credibility had already been done. The farmers, meanwhile, were left to deal with the consequences of the failed military intervention. With the soldiers gone, the responsibility to protect their crops fell solely on them. Faced with the ongoing emu threat, they turned to any means they could: fences, nets, and traps in hopes of safeguarding their livelihood. But the emus, with their ability to cover large areas and adapt quickly to new obstacles, proved to be a formidable challenge even for the farmers. The battle, it seemed, would continue, though no longer under the banner of the military. Throughout the ordeal, the emus had proven themselves to be a force to be reckoned with. They had outsmarted the soldiers, evaded gunfire, and outpaced the very vehicles designed to capture them. The military might of Australia had failed to subdue a population of birds. In the end, the emus remained in the fields, their numbers undiminished. Australia had waged war against them and, in every sense, lost. The emus had won, and the farmers and government alike were left to reckon with the aftermath of an improbable and unexpected defeat. The Great Emu War, once a turbulent and humiliating chapter in Australian history, gradually faded from the forefront of public memory, yet its legacy endured. Over time, it morphed into a curious tale of military absurdity, an event that defied logic and reason. What began as a serious attempt to control a growing pest population transformed into an enduring symbol of the unpredictability of nature and the limitations of human power. The story of the Emu campaign became a staple of historical reflection, often recounted by historians, journalists, and comedians alike. It was laughed off as one of the most bizarre and improbable military engagements in history, with the emus, against all odds, standing as the unlikely victors. Though the immediate war had ended, the struggle for farmers continued in the years that followed. They persevered in their efforts to protect their land from the ever-growing emu population. Despite their best efforts building fences, laying traps, and employing various methods to safeguard crops, the emus thrived, their numbers swelling with each passing season. These birds had become more than a nuisance. They were now a symbol of nature's resilience, a reminder of how even the most powerful human forces could be thwarted by an unexpected foe. The farmers, worn and weary, found themselves in an ongoing battle with these stubborn, persistent creatures, their daily lives marked by the relentless presence of the emus. As time marched on, the world saw wars fought with tanks, planes, and the brutal sacrifices of human lives. The term war became synonymous with conflict on a global scale, where victories and losses were measured by military might and the human cost of such struggles. Yet, in the midst of all these wars, there lingered the story of the Emu War so strange that it often seemed out of place in the grand narrative of global history. It was a reminder that, sometimes, the battlefield was not confined to the traditional weapons of war, but rather to an unforeseen, natural force that could turn the tide in ways no one could predict. The legacy of the Great Emu War thus remained, not just as an absurd anecdote, but as a reflection of the unexpected battles life throws at us. The emus, once seen merely as pests, had outwitted and outlasted one of the most powerful forces of their time, turning an embarrassing defeat into a symbol of persistence and triumph. In the years that followed, the tale of the Emu War became a fitting metaphor for battles that defy logic, where the unassuming and the underestimated can emerge victorious, leaving behind a lesson in humility for all who would listen. Thanks for tuning into the past. Don't forget to subscribe and join me for more stories that shaped our world.